This is the Pal Talk News Network.
The views expressed are solely those of the speaker and not necessarily those of paltalk.com, AVM Software, or its advertisers.
News Talk is online. News Talk Online, a production of paltalk.com, the largest multimedia interactive program on the internet with more than 4 million unique users on demand on iTunes and on YouTube and on my blog, GaryBaumgarten.com, where you're encouraged to post your comments, whether you agree with yours truly or not. No retribution. And thanks to our good friends at CRN Digital Talk Radio, we're syndicated to an additional 12 million households. I am your host, Gary Baumgarten. I welcome you to the show, and I remind you that you should be going to paltalknewsnetwork.com early and often to check for stories that you may or may not see, hear, or read in the mainstream media. You know, you guys know that I usually start the show pretty even-tempered, and it sometimes builds up to a crescendo by the end of the show because I get worked up by some of the things that we're talking about and some of the comments that are made. But today, I have to warn you, I start the show royally pissed off, and I will tell you why. You know, I'm used to hearing this kind of rhetoric from the anti-Semites. I'm used to seeing this kind of rhetoric come out of the official Palestinian television stations where they warp the minds of the children with blood libel against the Israelis. Of course, my parents, my grandparents, and many of our parents and grandparents heard it and saw it leading up to the Holocaust when the Nazis and the other fascists in Europe presented the blood libel against the Jews. But I never expected that it would come from the United Nations. Now, don't get me wrong. I have long ago lost faith in the United Nations. When I was covering it for CNN, is when I lost faith. I went in there very hopeful. After covering it for the UN for 10 years, I walked away very dejected, very disappointed. But you don't expect that on the website of the so-called Human Rights Council that they would allow a nonprofit, non-government organization founded in Libya in 1981, supposedly a group called EAFORD, the International Organization for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, to publish this blood libel that the Israeli army and Israeli doctors are killing Palestinians, kidnapping them and killing them in order to pluck their organs and use them for God knows what. Our guest, who we only have for a few minutes today, is the director of UN Watch, Hillel Neuer. And let me tell you what happens with UN Watch, which you should be reading on a regular basis, which keeps an eye on the United Nations and it keeps them on the straight and narrow like nobody else does, by the way, because people are afraid to do so for one reason or another. I don't know. He got bitch slapped by this same Human Rights Council for the audacity of calling the government in Iran a regime. Well, Hillel Neuer, guess what? So do I. I call it a regime as well. Welcome to News Talk Online on the Pal Talk News Network.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and to be able to speak in a forum that allows the truth to be told and allows for freedom of expression, which regrettably too often at the UN is simply not the case.
Well, you're not that familiar with this show or with the network, but we actually go out and solicit various points of view, even points of view that are contrary to the hosts, because we want all viewpoints to be heard and let the consumer decide. I'm not going to spoon feed the people who come to this show or who read our website and tell them how to think. I expect them to challenge me, and if I'm wrong, I expect them to tell me that I am wrong. But on this one, I think they would be hard-pressed to do so. How can, Hillel, in your opinion, the Human Rights Council help propagate such hatred towards the Israelis?
Well, I think, in this case, there are some specific facts that allowed a written statement by the group that you mentioned, which is a Libyan front group that is dedicated to promoting anti-Semitic and anti-Israel incitement of the very worst kind, and is known to everyone for many years, and yet is allowed to remain as a recognized, accredited observer group, NGO, a non-governmental group at the UN. And this particular fact of how this blood libel against Israel was allowed to be published by a UN website and remains today online on the UN Human Rights Council website. There are specific facts in this case, but much larger is what this case represents. And this case represents a situation at the UN Human Rights Council, which is supposed to be the highest body on human rights of the world, and yet in the last session, which just concluded on Friday, they slammed Israel in 5 separate resolutions, each of them one-sided, each of them turning a blind eye to terrorism, sponsored, promoted by Hamas and Hezbollah, financed and trained by Iran and Syria, turned a blind eye to all of that, slammed Israel in 5 resolutions, at the same time dedicated only 3 resolutions to the rest of the world combined. 5 against Israel, 3 for the rest of the world combined. This is standard fare at the Human Rights Council, and it's a body that was founded by Eleanor Roosevelt with the noblest of dreams, but the reality today is that instead of Eleanor Roosevelt, we have Gaddafi, who was the leading figure at the Human Rights Council.
And I bet you the Human Rights Council is silent on the meeting just ended between the Arab League and the Palestinians, in which they urge, including Iran's surrogate, most notably Syria, urge the Palestinians to not return to the bargaining table with the Israelis, but to take the fight to the streets.
Well, unfortunately, that's absolutely right. The Human Rights Council has continued to encourage the most extreme form of politics in the region. Each of their resolutions on the Middle East gives succor to the terrorists and gives encouragement to countries, as you mentioned, like Iran and Syria. And, Kofi Annan, who is hardly a pro-Israel figure, when he left the UN in 2006, he asked the General Assembly, he asked the Security Council, rather, what have all these resolutions, these special mechanisms, experts, inquiries for the Palestinians, what have they ever done for the Palestinians? And the answer is nothing. These resolutions call themselves pro-Palestinian, but the reality is that they're not only anti-Israel, they're anti-Palestinian, because they encourage extremism, which has only hurt the Palestinians, and you know what? It's hurt the UN as a whole. And it's time to go back to founding principles that Eleanor Roosevelt thought about, which are objectivity, truth, democracy. Unfortunately, the Democratic faction at the UN is in a small minority, and they're playing defense. Now, America has joined the Human Rights Council, and we, UN Watch, gave a qualified welcome to that. We said, join the Human Rights Council if you will use the podium to go after the abusers, to speak truth to power, and to hold abusers to account. And while I applaud the U.S. for a number of things that they've tried to do to beat back pro-Islamic resolutions which are against free speech and promote an idea that you cannot mention Islam and terrorism, you cannot talk about Al-Qaeda at all at the Human Rights Council, it's taboo. I applaud the U.S. for various efforts to beat back that culture. At the same time, the U.S. has failed to introduce a single resolution on Iran, despite massacres happening there, people being beaten, arrested, show trials.